To my right, I heard a distant flutter, and what I thought was a faint screech. A loud mechanical click signaled the lights turning on and filling even the deepest corners of the cavern with comforting light. Graham returned, and with a wave he ushered me to follow him. "All right, let's start this private tour," he said, heading right in the direction of the eerie sounds I had just heard. "There's no creaky plumbing down here, is there?" I asked, remembering the sink in the old house. "Nope. All creaky sounds are natural cave occurrences," he joked. I hoped. I followed him anyway. The walk through the main chambers and less traveled paths was long and filled mostly with small talk. Graham lamented on the fact that reopening wasn't guaranteed, despite the money they spent on the remodel. He truly loved the caverns and couldn't see himself doing anything else. "People would die for this gig. It's the creme de la creme of Park Service posts. I realize how lucky I am to have it." He said it with a tinge of real sadness. It became obvious that we were reaching the end of the modern map, because the lights started to stagger more with longer distance between each light. The fixtures themselves were older than the rest, and some were entirely out, creating breaks of darkness in the already dim cavern. Each time we reached an old iron gate, he would search a massive keying for the one out of dozens keys that would open it. Eventually, the lights no longer lit our way, and he switched on the lamps and handed me a helmet. "I probably should have given you this earlier, but these low ceilings make it a necessity now," he said with a smile. I followed behind in a half-crouch as he pointed out interesting geological sites that had been hidden from the public for decades. I noticed that some of the cave walls were starting to display that same dark red and blue mineral veins as the crystals I had collected from their chamber. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to rune carvings I recognized from room below the motel. "No idea what it says. Old-timey graffiti," I guess he assured me. As the ceiling and walls seemed to close in around us with each step, the warm air seemed thicker as well. I felt as though it was getting difficult to breathe, and my back was stretching to ache from the unnatural posture. Graham must have sensed my discomfort. "It opens up a little bit further ahead." "We're almost there," he said, trying to comfort me. He was right, and as soon as we reached the next chamber, the air seemed to grow colder as well. The floor that had until now been paved with a gripping cement had given way to the cavern's natural floor, a slippery surface that felt very much like sandstone. "I present," the Gulchy said while grabbing a hold of my jacket to prevent me from passing him. He switched on a very bright lantern and lit up the enormous room. My breath left my lungs as I noticed why he had grabbed a hold of me. The steep drop-off was only a few feet ahead, and it was more of a cliff than an incline. It dropped down maybe 20 or 30 feet into a lower tunnel that led into further darkness. "How do we get down?" I asked, leaning forward to get a better look. "We don't. Tour stops here. If we so much as sprained an ankle, we're pretty much done for. No cell service, nobody knows we're here, and nobody will come looking for weeks. That level of irresponsibility would cost me my job," he said, finally serious. But his adherence to the rules went out the door when we heard that haunting sound. A faint cry echoed out from the darkness past the gulch. "Do bats make it down this far?" I asked, my voice shaky and afraid. I watched his mind wrestle with the possibilities as he shook his head slowly. "Then what was that?" I asked. He turned to me, his eyes wide and afraid. He shook his head again. As my own voice echoed down the cavernous path ahead, the sound ceased as if hearing me. In those brief moments of silence, when we still shared a doubt that we had heard anything at all, I could feel him pull my jacket to lead me back out. But then we heard it. "You've returned?" asked a voice from the distant darkness. It sounded like an echo without a voice to reflect. I could feel Graham's body tense and stiffen with the acceptance that what we heard was very real and not from our own imaginations. "What have you brought me?" it called out, vulnerable and afraid. "Nobody should be down there." "How did you get down there?" Graham asked, as if he wanted an answer from himself and not the ghostly voice below. There was a moment where neither spoke. It was as if both of them were working out what to say next. "Who's up there?" "Please help," it said, the voice now small and almost childlike, more vulnerable than before. "I'm a park ranger." "I can help you," he said, and I realized that it was now me holding onto his jacket, trying to hold him back. "Stay where you are," he called out to the childlike voice in the darkness. He turned to me with a look of defeat or unwanted heroism. "We have to help," he choked out. "Do we?" I asked as he moved past me to an old metal utility trunk just to the right of the room. As he struggled to find the key that opened the trunk, I peered into the darkness looking for any sign of movement. For a moment I thought I saw a small pale form move just beyond the edge of the shadows, but my attention was soon taken by the metal groan of the trunk opening. Graham pulled out a rope ladder that attached to the side of the already secured trunk and dropped it below. The ladder unraveled along the steep incline all the way to the floor. "I've been trapped. Please come down and help me," the childlike voice said, slowly losing all emotion, the urgency replaced with a calm sense of command. I followed after Graham as he descended down the ladder. As my hands grazed the coarse granular texture of the cavern wall, it felt as if the moisture was drawn from my skin. With each labored step down, the cold, dry air stung my lungs. By the time I reached the bottom, Graham was already halfway across the gulch with the lantern held high. Somehow, the light seemed to still stop at the edge of the shadowy darkness ahead. "How did you get down here?" he asked, walking slowly towards the darkness ahead. "I've always been down here," said the voice, its childlike essence giving way to a frightening growl. At the edge of the darkness, Graham stopped to adjust the lamp, doing everything he could to cast more light towards the unseen voice. With his attention on the lamp, Graham didn't even see it coming. He had no time to react. A pale white figure emerged from the darkness and skittered across the cavern floor, grabbed Graham by the ankles and pulled him to the ground. The lantern shattered on impact. I stood there frozen at the bottom of the ladder, my own light only casting a few feet in front of me. "Graham," I called out. "Run," he responded in a gurgled, gasping moan. So I climbed. I climbed faster than I thought possible, skipping rungs with each aching pull as my muscles worked on instinct and adrenaline. I could hear the cold, wet patter of naked flesh hitting the cavern floor as the figure raced towards me. When I reached the top of the ladder, I glanced back to see the figure pulling itself across the floor with an unnatural speed. As I turned to pull the ladder up, my light cast just far enough to reach the bottom of the gulch. A withered claw-like hand covered in bright red blood reached out and grabbed the bottom rung. It pulled with an inhuman strength. I braced myself and pulled back. I could hear its other hand clawing at the sandpaper-like surface of the cavern wall, struggling to gain footing. I looked to my right, into the open utility trunk. Sitting atop a coil of rope and other gear was a silver-coated pickaxe. As I felt myself teetering on the edge of falling, I let go of the rope. I grabbed the pickaxe and in one fluid motion I swung hard, severing one side of the rope ladder. But still it climbed, the shriveled torso of a ghost white child covered in Graham's blood. It looked up from below with soulless black eyes. There was no fear, only hunger. From its waist hung long strips of withered flesh and mangled bone, what I assume were once its legs. The creature made it halfway up the ladder before I swung again, fraying the remaining side of rope. The creature did not slow, undeterred by my pickaxe. My mind raced as I considered my next swing. The rope or the creature. I wasn't sure if the next blow would cut the rope, but I was even less sure that I could kill whatever it was that was climbing. I swung. The rope snapped and the ladder fell below. The creature slid back down the incline, hitting the bottom with a sickening wet thud. I waited with bated breath as I listened for movement. I called out hopelessly into the darkness. "Graham." "He is no more," said the voice from directly below. I swallowed hard and held my lantern over the edge. As the shadows crept back, they revealed the creature below. I expected a crumpled, broken mess from the fall, but instead, there it was staring up at me, unfazed. Though its resemblance to a human was slight, I could see aspects of the family in its emotionless stare and pale, waxy skin beneath wet, red blood. The naked figure was child-sized, but its limbs and features were distorted, odd and long. Its bulbous, veiny head held two bulging black eyes with thin lips that barely restrained sharp, jagged teeth. It looked as though it may have been human at one time, but its form now was nothing more than a legless, emaciated ghoul with dry and withered skin. Its few remaining strands of hair were matted down with wet blood. "Will you please help me out?" it asked. "Why are you down here?" I cried. "They took my legs and left me to rot," it said, with its shark-like eyes locked on mine. "Who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. I gave her the gift, but she turned on me. "I can give you gift too, if you help me up," it sneered. "How?" I asked. "I will drink from you and you will drink from me, and when you slumber beneath this salted earth, it will leach out the very essence of death from your being. We can live here together forever, but each night you will follow me here, and we will die beneath the crystalline earth. Only to wake at night, revived by the salted soils," it said, digging its claws into a patch of loose gravelly sand. My fingers tightened around the pickaxe. "What is stopping you from killing me once I help you?" I asked. "Solitude. Eternity is meaningless if you are alone." "What about Graham?" I asked, pointing into the darkness. "Can you bring him back?" "He is not worthy of the gift. You must choose it. He is nothing more than a meal, sustenance after a famine. But you, I can smell the gift on you. You know of my children, you know what it means." "If they are your children, why are you here?" I asked. She accepted the gift, and we lived for years, preying on the weak that wandered into our realm. And then he arrived and stole her attention from me. When she gave him the gift, he convinced her to leave our home. When I refused to let her go, he took my legs, and they left me down here to starve. But as I said, death does not come easy down here. Not for us. "If I help you, you can make me like you?" I asked, my voice shaky and unsure. "Yes," it smiled. I looked down at the silver axe in my hands. I thought back to the silver-tipped bullets in my grandfather's box. He must have known. This pickaxe was here for a reason, coated in shimmering silver. I knew what I had to do. I tied off the coiled rope in the box and dropped it down. The creature quickly grabbed hold and pulled itself up, one clawed hand over the other. It climbed as its mangled lower half dangled below. I stepped back and readied myself. As the creature crested the incline and pulled itself onto my level, I raised the pickaxe high over my head. Quickly, I brought it down on the creature's skull with a sickening crunch. I let go, and the blood-covered ghoul fell forward onto the ground in front of me. Slowly, it turned its head, and the black, expressionless eyes locked on mine. "Silly. Silver slows but cannot kill us," it smiled, baring its rows of sharp teeth. As it wrapped its sickeningly long fingers around the handle of the axe, I reached into my pocket. It pulled at the handle, trying to free the pickaxe from its head, too focused on what was in my hand. I lurched forward with the only weapon I had left, the sharp crystalline rock. But the creature was fast and swiped at my feet with an incredible quickness, just as it did with Graham. I fell backwards hard and hit my head on the rocks, but the helmet saved me from an almost certain concussion or worse. I was still woozy when the creature climbed on top of me, the pickaxe still embedded in its skull. With one arm I fought it back, holding it by the neck. With the other I gripped crystalline rock. With its face only inches from mine, I closed my eyes and plunged it into the creature's chest. Almost immediately, the skin around the puncture withered and cracked as the rock leached the life from the creature. I pushed it off of me and crawled backwards. The creature's blank stare gave way to true horror as it looked down at the fatal piercing blow. Confused, its hands weakly clawed at the embedded stone. I stood up and removed the axe from its skill. Again, I raised it high and then brought it down hard. This time the skull collapsed beneath the blow. Its flesh crumbled in decay until nothing but dust and blood sat before me, soaking into a sludgy mess. Confident that I had ended this ancient evil, I pushed curdled blood and mudded flesh into the gulch below. I then used the rope to climb back down into the gulch, unwilling to take the creature's word that Graham was gone. As I stepped into the darkness, the ground squished beneath me. I directed the light to my feet and the massive amounts of blood that surrounded them. I found Graham only a few feet into the darkness. His body was cold, but I could have sworn I still felt a pulse. Blood oozed from large gashes in his throat, stomach, and arms. Still, I had to try. He was heavy, but I managed to drag him all the way back to the rope. It was only then that I had the realization that there was no way I could get him out, not on my own. By the time I could find help, he would surely be dead. And if he were dead, I would have to explain why. The creature that inflicted his wounds was nothing more than blood-soaked dust, which made for a poor explanation. They would ask how I found him, what happened, and how he could have lost so much blood without a jagged rock in sight. I stood there watching his blood slowly ooze out into the grainy sand beneath, mixing with the discolored sludge of the creature that had killed him. I made peace with my only viable option. I would leave him here and hope that by the time they found him it would look like he fell climbing down. I didn't want my friend to stay here forever, but just long enough to not incriminate me with defensive wounds. I knew that he would understand. We both witnessed an unnatural evil, and there was no way anybody else would believe it, not without evidence. I pulled my crystalline stone from the bloody muck and stuffed it back into my pocket. After I said my goodbyes to Graham, it took me hours to find my way back out of the caverns. Back in the gift shop, I cleaned myself up and did my best to remove any evidence I had visited. I even returned the helmet to the rack after wiping away any trace of blood. I was tired and weak by the time I stumbled outside into the night. I drove home in a daze and barely remembered crawling into bed. The days that followed were heavy with guilt and sorrow. Graham lost his life because of my foolish actions, and even though it meant the evil down there was finally gone, I couldn't help but wish it was me instead of Graham that was still down there, rotting, waiting to be found. On the third day after the events in the cavern, I was awoken mid-afternoon by a knocking at the office door. I expected to open it to a weary traveler, but instead I found myself face to face with the sheriff. He lowered his sunglasses and cut right to the point. "Mind if I come inside? I got questions about I have a feeling you might know something." "Sure," I said, breathless and already worried. I led him inside the office and he made his way over to the check-in desk. He pulled out a tablet from under his jacket and set it down. "You're familiar with Ranger Graham Nillis?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I glanced at the coffee counter in the lobby and nodded. "You were with him on Thursday, correct?" he asked, as if I had already admitted to it. With him I stumbled. The sheriff turned on the tablet, and as he navigated it, he said, "We have CCTV footage showing you at the cavern's visitor center." Before I could even answer, the video was already playing. I watched myself walking across the parking lot and waving to a smiling, still living Graham. Yes, I brought him coffee. He used to come in often, but it had been a while. So I stopped by. "Is he okay?" I asked, regretting my last question. The sheriff cocked his head to the side, questioning me. "Just coffee?" he asked. My brain seemed to shut down, overloaded with the possibilities of what he knew, why he was there, and why he hadn't arrested me yet. Well, he showed me around the renovations I offered. He nodded, accepting my answer. "Gotcha," he said, already navigating to another video. "Is there a problem?" "Did he get in trouble?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Well, there is a problem. Not that you did anything wrong," he said, in an almost apologetic manner. He could sense my discomfort and cleared his throat. Before he hit play on the video, he explained, "Did he mention anything strange when you met? Did he seem afraid of anybody, anything?" "No," I lied. "So, after you left, he missed his rounds. We believe he slept in the center that evening, which isn't illegal. He has late nights and early days, I get it. But when he did emerge later that night, well," he said, hitting play. I watched the grainy video fast forward until the door to the center opened. The sheriff then slowed the video and I watched as Graham staggered out of the visitor's center, still alive. I bit my tongue to hide my surprise. "Notice that he is possibly impaired," he said, pointing to Graham as he stumbled across the parking lot. "We think he may have hit his head while... Well, I don't know," he added. "Is he okay?" I asked, with genuine hope. Without answering my question, he asked another, "Do you recognize this car?" I watched as the familiar old station wagon pulled into the parking lot. I was too shocked to answer. The family had returned. almost 4 years too early. I watched as they pounced on Graham, but they did not hurt him. Instead, they dragged him to the bed of his own truck and tied him down at the ankles and wrists. His arms and legs were splayed out to each corner of the bed, the two men holding each arm, while the middle-aged woman and older woman held his legs. The teenage girl just stood there watching him. And even though the footage was grainy, I swear I could see somebody else watching from the car window. My sister. "Hold on, you don't need to see this," he stumbled, trying to end the video but instead fast-forwarding it. I watched as the family got back in their car and left, leaving Graham exposed in his truck. I watched as the sun crept across the parking lot as it rose above the trees. I watched his body ignite the moment the sunrise reached his foot. I watched it burn him slowly from his feet all the way to his head until there was nothing more than a charred corpse. I watched my friend die a second time. "I'm so sorry." You should not have seen that, he stuttered, finally just powering down the tablet. There was a moment of silence as he let me process the horrific murder I had just witnessed. We believe they doused him in an unknown accelerant. We're not sure how, but they burned him alive. Just like the young man we found in Henley's truck. We just want to know why. "Do you recognize them?" he asked. I shook my head in disbelief. "We don't know who they are, but we feel they may be responsible for both deaths," he trailed off. I felt my head spin and asked to sit down. Realizing that I had just witnessed my friend's death, the sheriff eased up on the questions and tried to soften the situation. He offered me his card and told me to call him if I remembered anything. He left me there on the couch in the lobby, reeling from the realization that I no longer had 4 years to figure it out. They were already here, and that means they would be checking in sooner than later. I couldn't help but feel that somehow they knew what I had done. I needed to come up with a plan to keep myself safe and somehow free my sister from their grasp, but instead all I could do was replay the last words the sheriff said before I completely shut down. He had pointed again to the frozen frame of the old man, the old woman, the middle-aged couple, and the teenage girl and asked, "Have you ever rented a room to this family?" I lied and told him, "No." The family was coming and there was no way I could escape. Not without my sister. Unwilling to die in my bed, I decided to wait for them in the office, just as I always had. The revolver rested neatly on my lap and the coffee pot brewed in the corner. I considered collecting the crystalline rocks beneath the room to fashion some sort of weapon, but I feared they would notice their absence and act before I could. I still had the one that ended that ravenous fiend in the caverns, but there was no way I could dispatch all of them in the same manner. Not like that. They were never alone. So I sat in the office, plotting their demise and fighting the overwhelming urge to sleep. It was some time after midnight when they arrived. Despite the unlit vacancy sign and the empty parking lot, they pulled in as they always did, parking right outside their room. The middle-aged man was the first to exit the car, rushing to the door with a restrained urgency. The middle-aged woman followed behind. When they found it locked, both stood at the door. In unison, they turned towards the old man as he stepped out of the car. There he was, the park ranger from the photos with the same haunting stare. The three exchanged knowing glances, then turned their attention to the office, to me. I gripped the revolver tight and watched as the old man opened the back door of the station wagon. When he stepped aside, a dark figure emerged. For a moment she appeared as a walking shadow, devoid of light, but the truth was more horrifying than that. The teenage girl, covered head to toe in fresh blood, stepped into the parking lot of my motel. On the other side of the car, the old woman emerged. The teenage girl stood facing my direction for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for something. I realized all of them were looking directly at me. The teenage girl moved first. She turned back to the car and reached inside. When she turned back to me, she was holding my sister. It was the way that she held her in her blood-soaked arms that I could tell this was a threat. The old man broke from the group and walked towards the office. Behind them, they all stared. I took a deep breath and readied myself for what I had to do. As he approached, he glanced up at the old sign that hung above, "You're always welcome." He grabbed the knob and turned it, and when he opened the door, he smiled. It was the same fake smile I'd seen 100 times. He then removed his hat and entered. "Hello, we'd like to rent a room. Please," he said. I sat there in disarmed shock. I was unsure of what to do next, but my instincts took over for me. "Okay," I said, surprising even myself. I turned to grab the key hanging behind my desk and once again got a glimpse of the teenage girl. Her eyes were still locked on me and my sister was still gripped tightly in her arms. "Here you go," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. He took the key with a polite nod and walked casually out of the office. I watched him join the family and head directly to the room. With an unnerving sense of normalcy, he opened the door and entered. The rest followed in a straight line, except for the teenage girl. She put down my sister, who then ran into the unlit room behind the others. The teenage girl remained. She watched me through the window with an unnerving gaze. I only looked away for a moment, but it was long enough for her to disappear. Immediately, I reached for the phone. I had lied for too long and brought pain and despair to everyone around me. I pulled the sheriff's card from my pocket and dialed. He picked up after one ring. "Sheriff," I whispered. "Ah, you again. Did you happen to remember?" "They're here," I said, cutting him off. There was a moment of silence. "The motel?" he asked. "Yes. Same room." There, the line went dead. I dialed again. No answer. I gathered my thoughts and tried to work out a plan. I had to figure out a way to separate them from my sister. I needed to get her alone so that we could escape together. Monster or not, she was still my only family. I had only gotten as far in my plan as I need to get her alone when I heard the car approach. The red and blue lights flashed in the distance as the cruiser approached at a very high speed. However, the moment he hit the parking lot, he killed the lights and slowed to a crawl. I watched him park too close to the family's station wagon. Then again, he was the only other vehicle in the parking lot. There was nowhere to hide. I went to the door, revolver in hand, and peered out through the window next to it. With one hand on the knob, I waited for him. Again, he stayed in his car for an uncomfortably long time, his sense of urgency seemingly lost. I then realized he was probably calling in support. But I thought wrong. Instead, he opened the door, and with a casual saunter, he made his way to the family's room. "No," I said in a hoarse whisper. I opened the door to warn him, but before I could get out a word, he knocked. He waited, then opened the door himself and went inside. Terrified, I wanted nothing more than to go back inside the office, but it was foolish to think anywhere was safe. I stepped outside with the gun in my hand and crept towards the room. I lingered back by the cars, listening for any sign of a struggle. Minutes later, that sign came in the form of 6 gunshots. Bang, 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 bang. They were followed by silence. I ran, but not in the direction I expected. I ran towards the room. 6 shots for 6 members of the family. Foolishly, I had hoped he missed the last one. "Stay where you are," he yelled from inside the room. I pushed open the door and stumbled inside. What I found was not the heroic scene of a small-town lawman standing over slain demons, but instead he was lying in the corner of the room, bleeding profusely from the gut. As I stepped into the room, the family gently pushed me aside as they walked calmly out of the room. They paid no notice to the revolver dangling at my side. The old man tipped his hat and flashed that fake smile as he passed, as if this were nothing out of the ordinary. "Where are you going? You can't leave now," the sheriff shouted through the blood pooling in his mouth. Blam! He fired the gun again, straight into his own stomach. "Now you have to turn me. You have to turn me," now he shouted, and with each word the exertion pushed oozing blood from his wounds. The older woman ignored him as she collected her earrings from the side table and walked out the door, followed by the teenage girl, now cleaned of blood and changed into a modest dress, neither acknowledging the dying man in the corner. "I covered up everything for you. You owe me this," he whimpered. And with that the door shut behind them, leaving me standing in the cursed room with this dying man. Did you shoot yourself?" I asked. Frustrated, he waved the gun wildly as blood seeped from his nose, mouth, and multiple bullet holes. It seemed like a good idea at the time, he joked, laughing through the pain. I know they need me, but I guess I miscalculated how much. I looked down at this dying man and couldn't help but feel vindicated in my mistrust. He'd be a doll and call an ambulance, would you? He said, the color draining from his face. I pulled out my phone. A look of momentary relief flashed across his face. I started to dial, but then stopped. What do you mean? They need you? I asked, my finger hovering over the send button. Frantic worry set in as he realized why I hesitated. Oh, cut the shit. We both know what they are. You don't have to lie anymore. You helped me find them. We both want the same thing, you and I, he sputtered. I don't think so. What did you do for them? I asked. He laughed in disbelief. Really? Did you ever wonder what happened to the bodies once they were done with them? The ones they didn't leave on the side of the road for me to handle. I shook my head. It's your property. It's big, but not that big, he said, realizing that I didn't know. Where? I asked, thinking about all the off-limits places my father had restricted us from. Dangerous sinkholes, the old septic tank, the open caves. My parents would never, I said, knowing it was a lie. Your parents, maybe, but the old couple that ran this place did every damn thing they were asked. And look what it got them. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. It got them their little girl back, he said weakly. I stood over the dying man, my whole world coming down around me. I knew the answers, but I was still not ready for the truth. I looked out in the direction of where the bodies were hidden, as if looking through the wall itself, searching for them. The septic, he said, as if he could read my mind. But you don't want to see that. I realized how close to death he was and hit send on the phone. Don't bother, he said. Even if you drove, I'd only make it to Gillis Road. 911. What's your emergency? Said the voice on the other line. I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come, stuck in my mouth with uncertainty. The sheriff shook his head. Sorry, Miss Dial. My apologies. Have a nice night, I said, and hung up. Do what you will with my body, but without me they're going to come looking. And when they do, those monsters will be long gone and you will be left to clean up and take the blame. You should probably have a plan for that. But I didn't do anything. It was all them, I said, choking on my words. It's your property, sort of, he said, pausing as a thought slowly came to him. They don't care if you fear them. They are smarter than that. They only care that you fear death. I watched as the life slowly drained from his body. I wanted to hold his hand, to comfort him, but my own repulsion of what he had done overrode my empathy. As he faded away, he looked me in the eyes and muttered one last thing. I remember your parents. What a shame. You should never have been left here with them. His voice trailed as his eyes glazed over and his heart finally stopped. I rolled him into an old sheet and dragged his body to the cruiser outside. With great effort, I was able to heave his corpse into the back seat. I drove it around to the back of the motel, and then returned to clean up the trail of streaked blood that led from the room to the parking lot. I used buckets of warm water from the shower and scrubbed it clean with an old push broom. It was a poor job, but I didn't have time for perfection. I drove the cruiser along the strange path I had avoided my entire life. My father had told me as a child that this place was unsafe, and as an adult he further emphasized the danger of it. This is where he took old rusted propane tanks that had sat for so long the sulfur smell had faded into a deadly absence. This is where he disposed of waste that was unfit for the burn pit. This is where he said that if I ever wandered into, it would cause everlasting harm. At least he was telling the truth about that. When I reached the unrecognizable location that I had avoided for years, I stopped the car. I retrieved the large flashlight from the trunk and continued on, looking for what any sign of, well, death. I saw the rusted white paint of old propane tanks buried halfway beneath a layer of dirt and fallen leaf, and walked in that direction. The smell hit first. The putrid stench of decay that was so thick you could taste it. The ground beneath me seemed to soften as I neared the trench where an old septic tank once was. It was never used and removed some time after I was born. It was the remnants of the dream home my father always promised to build for my mother. Instead, they settled into their macabre routine and lived out their lives in the small cottage attached to the motel. I always thought that my sister's death was the reason the dream was abandoned, but it turns out they just found other uses for the plot. As my view crested over the ditch, my mind struggled to comprehend the amount of death that was discarded just a few feet in front of me. Bodies in various states of decay. Most of them were years or decades old, stacked without regard to their humanity. Rotted bodies sat atop sun-bleached bones resting on a thick layer of decayed flesh, and on top of it all was poor Bill Henley. His body was almost unrecognizable, no longer the strong, imposing man that stood outside his truck. Now he was nothing more than a withered white corpse, drained of everything that gave him life. Small incisions covered his legs, arms, belly, and neck. He was drained of blood and wiped clean. His eyes were now nothing more than deep black sockets. I feel guilt for not warning him, but I realized I had a chance to make it right. I pulled the sheriff from the back seat and dragged his body to the pit and rolled him down. He landed just next to Bill. I collected the bloody sheet and carried them over to the nearby burn pit, the one my father rarely used. I lit a match and tossed it onto the sheets. As I watched the flames consume and burn the bloody sheets, I laughed at the futility of burning evidence when I had a pit of dead bodies only a few feet away. What was I trying to hide? In the wake of that epiphany, I formulated a plan. I stomped out the burning sheets and smothered the fire. I would need those later. I returned to the cruiser and siphoned most of the gas from the tank, spilling it into a bucket I found nearby. I soaked the sheets and any dry wood I could find, which wasn't much. I then maneuvered the cruiser to the edge of the grave so the headlights would illuminate the rotting mound of death. As I walked across the corpses searching for fat-soaked clothing or anything that would burn, I could hear the old bones snap and crunch beneath my weight. I listened to the nauseating squish of rotted organs rupturing below. By the time I climbed out, the smell of death and gasoline were undistinguishable. It didn't matter, though. I knew exactly how I was going to dispatch these horrible, soulless creatures. I knew exactly how I was going to kill these vampires that had haunted me my entire life. These beings that cursed my family's very existence. I was going to bring justice to these people. I was going to murder every last one of the family, except, of course, my sister. Red blood seeped into the clean white towels sitting where the sheriff took his final breath. It smelled of rusted iron and musty linen. It was an odd feeling to stand in that empty motel room where decades of untold carnage had taken place so close to where I spent my life. Somehow, though, it still felt like home. In all my years of emptying the ashtray and replacing their unused sheets, I never lingered for longer than I had to. In the back of my mind, I believe I had always sensed the evil beneath the floorboards. But now, I had all the time in the world to linger. I was waiting for their return. It was only an hour or so before sunrise when I heard the familiar rattling shake of their old station wagon pulling into the parking lot. I gathered up the towels, stuffed them into my cleaning cart, and did my best to remain small and invisible when the door opened. The old man was the first to enter. He greeted me with that eerie fake smile. The others followed in after. I pushed my things aside and waited for my chance to exit. The teenage girl entered last, holding the hand of my sister. They continued about their business, as if I weren't even there. Most of them headed straight to the bathroom where I heard the trap door open to their lair below. The old man stayed behind and lit up a cigarette, and then offered one to the old woman. She turned back from the bathroom and joined him at the table. My sister, on the other hand, immediately turned on the old television. She stood in the center of the room and watched as an old black-white Western movie began with a shot of the sunrise. With the older couple paying no attention to me, I leaned in and whispered to my sister. "I think you left this," I said, pulling the photo of her and I from my pocket. She broke her gaze from the cowboy on the screen and glanced at the photo. She took it from my hand. "I have the other half if you want it." "With Mama and Papa in it," I said, looking over at the old woman, who only spared me a passing glance. I lowered my voice even more. "I can bring it to you in a few hours. But you'll have to wake up early." She glanced at the curtains covering the window and the world outside. I tapped at the backside of the photo. She turned it over. I had written the words, "If you are alone, I will protect you," in red ink. She nodded. I left and returned to my room. I did my best to sleep for the next few hours, but I was constantly awoken by horribly vivid nightmares that reflected my current maddening reality. When the alarm went off, I had already been awake for an hour. I crawled out of bed and forced myself to eat something. With such a heavy sense of impending doom, I found it difficult to focus on the menial tasks like brushing my teeth. Too anxious to think about anything else, I checked the family's room, cracking the door slightly and peeking in. It was empty except for some lingering smoke that danced with the dust in the sunbeams. My sister was still asleep beneath the floorboards. I used this time to walk back out to the septic tank, where I lit the gasoline sheets and fat-soaked clothing in the burn pit. The flames reached high, and I prayed this would burn for at least a few hours, long enough to be noticed when the time came. At the edge of the pit, I looked down at the legacy of horror that my family would forever be aligned with. If it were ever discovered, this quaint motel in the mountains would not survive, and my grandfather's legacy would no longer end with its demolition but live on as macabre folklore. As the corpse-fat-fueled flames danced in the burned pit nearby, it became clear that I was on the precipice of insanity. My plan was little more than a half-baked assumption that I could somehow defeat beings that had lived over 3 of my lifetimes. But it felt as if I had no other choice, so I collected every single tank of propane that would fit into the cruiser. I stacked them floor to ceiling in the back seat, with a few more on the passenger side seat and floor. There was just enough gas left in the tank to make it back to the parking lot. Even sputtering on fumes, I was able to coast into a spot near the family's station wagon. The sun was low in the sky and daylight was waning. I checked the room again, knocking lightly as I entered. I slipped inside without opening the door wide and found my sister sitting on the bed, shrouded in the darkness of the heavy blackout curtains. I produced the photograph of my parents from my back pocket and handed it to her. "Do you still want to leave?" she asked. "Yes, but I will make sure you are safe. They won't trap you in those caves. I promise." "They think you changed your mind. Master said you are too afraid to leave this place. She said you are weak and insignificant. She said that you are nothing to fear." "She's wrong," I said, pulling the comforter from the bed. And the light was low, but it was enough harm her pale, fragile skin. I had seen how quickly it engulfed Graham. I knew how little it took to kill them. I had my sister lay on the bed and wrapped her in the comforters. I tucked in every corner and picked her up, holding the seams close to my body. I carried her to the office as fast as I could. Once inside, I took her behind the desk and told her to hide. The window shades were already drawn, but she remained covered, hunkered down behind the check-in counter. "Do not move until I return. Do you understand?" I asked. She nodded. I sprinted back to room as fast as my legs would take me. The sun was now setting, and I only had a short time before the family would wake. I remade the bed with the comforters from next door and smoothed them out, as if they would even notice. With everything back in place, I returned to the cruiser and dragged each tank into the room, one by one. I took the heaviest ones first and opened the valves wide. Some hissed violently, while others were a low, breathy whistle. The faded odor of sulfur was faint with age, and I barely noticed the scent. With the last tank open, I sealed the door shut and shoved wet towels at the base. I set a timer for sundown and hurried back to my sister. I found her huddled beneath the comforter with both photos in hand, holding them together as one. She looked up at me with sad eyes. "I wish I never had to leave. I miss being a child," she whimpered. The statement itself sounded so odd coming from such a little girl. "Do you remember why you left?" I asked. She nodded. "Mother said it was the only way. She promised to always be waiting, though. She lied." She did her best. "But people can't wait forever," I said, brushing her hair back. "We can," she said, looking up at me with eyes that I only now realized were marbled with deep black veins. "Why do you visit when you do?" "Every 4 years," I asked. "The road is long, and the further we go from caverns, the more we must feed. The more we feed, the more dangerous it gets." "Why don't you stay here, where it's safe?" I asked. We can only stay for as long as the earth allows us. If we stay too long, the soil becomes impure and poisoned, so we must always move. Only in the caverns can we sleep forever." "Then why not stay in the caverns?" I asked. "Would you choose a life eternal darkness and constant hunger?" she replied with the slightest hint of indignance. "No," I admitted. Before now, we had never stopped and we've never turned around. "So why now?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We had to return so Master could destroy the betrayer," she said with a laugh. My watch alarm beeped in warning dusk was coming. "Graham," I asked. She leaned in with the intensity of a zealot. When Uncle Matthew felt his father burn, he begged the Master to come back and seek vengeance. But she refused. She felt he was responsible for his own demise. Until she felt her Maker die. You see, we can feel the pain of the ones that made us. It keeps us connected. It keeps us safe. It makes us family. When we found that the betrayer had stolen the gift and killed our others, he deserved a painful death. My watch beeped again. I needed to return to the room, but my sister sensed this and grabbed me by the wrist. "He was my friend." "He didn't kill them," I said, taken aback by her reveling in his murder. "But he did. And she let him burn in the sun so that his agony would last. Only she decides who lives forever. That's why Mother's sister was mad. She was refused the gift, despite what Uncle Matthew promised. So she lit herself on fire and tried to take us with her. Uncle Matthew begged Master to wait for his father, but the boy was buried and the sun was coming soon. So we left him. Master said, "We do not have room for the weak," she said, her eyes ablaze with righteousness. I pulled my arm from her grasp and stood. "That all changes tonight," I said, stepping away from her. "I remember the day you arrived." "That was the day that everything changed," she replied. "You were a child when I was born," I said dismissively. "Yes, but I remember the day you arrived here. Mother found you hiding beneath the bed, too small to consume and too young to be worthy of notice. They left you orphaned, and Mother took you in," she said with a wicked smile, as if she could taste my pain. My mind immediately went back to the photo of myself with those strangers. I thought back to the coldness my mother had for me, while her warmth for other children was always evident. "I don't remember any of that," I said, my hand on the doorknob. "Why would you?" she said with an evil smirk. I did not want to believe her. The alarm beeped a final alert and I realized I was out of time. I sprinted to the family's room and pulled back the wet towel. I held it to my mouth and entered. I smelled nothing, but I swear I could sense a haziness to the air. I tied the towel around my mouth and grabbed the first 2 tanks. They were lighter than before, which means they were emptied. I hurried as fast as I could, throwing them into the parking lot. I just needed them to be out of the room. It was impossible to do quietly, but I did my best to muffle any bump while keeping the door closed as I entered and exited. While it took me a half hour to fill the room, it only took me minutes to empty it of the tanks. My hands bled from cuts on the rusted metal handles. On my way out with the final tank, I heard the floor in the bathroom creak as the hatch opened. I locked the door and returned the towel to the crack beneath the door. I moved a few of the tanks around the corner but abandoned the task when I heard movement inside. I sprinted back to the office and found my sister already standing in the center of the room. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Keeping you safe," I replied. "I am safe. She knows you won't hurt me." "You can't hurt any of us," she said. Standing in the doorway to the office, with my sister staring through me with those deep black eyes, I began to realize that she was not the little girl I thought I knew. It was her reveling in the pain of others that made me realize she was more them than me. In more ways than one, she wasn't my sister anymore. It was then that I heard an unholy scream come from inside the family's room. The teenage girl, the Master, had noticed my sister was gone. I thought for a moment that my plan was unraveling, but the old man was stuck in his habits. The door was thrown open, and the teenage girl emerged, beast-like in her anger. But the old man, the park ranger, was not concerned. Instead, he did as he always did. He lit a cigarette. The explosion shook the very foundation of the motel. Pictures were thrown from the walls and glass shattered. When I looked out at the parking lot, my ears still ringing, I saw the master lying motionless on the asphalt. I stepped outside with my sister rushing past me, letting out a primal scream as she ran to the master. Behind them, the motel room was aflame in hellish fire. I could hear a loud ghoulish moan even above the crackle of embers. The old man stumbled out, howling in pain. The first time in my life I had seen any sign of emotion from him. His flesh dripped from the bone as the heat melted his skin. His white skull was slowly revealed behind blackened flesh as it sloughed off his face. With each step he left behind charred chunks of melted skin and a smoldering trail of burning gore. He made it only a few more feet before collapsing in a heap of scorched agony. He struggled to crawl away from the flames, but as tried, his muscles separated from his body like what I can only describe as pulled pork. The building collapsed in on itself, trapping the others inside. I could hear their screams as they begged for the master to save them. She awoke suddenly and leaped up. Her eyes seemed to darken into black orbs set deep in her skull. She let out another primal scream and ran towards me. I reached into the back of my pants and pulled out the revolver, aimed and fired. The first shot struck her in the shoulder, and it seemed to surprise her, the pain from the silver-tipped bullet. She slowed for a moment, feeling the sting. I watched as my sister felt it too. The master bared her sharp teeth and continued on, but I waited to fire. I waited until I knew I would not miss. I waited until she was close enough to see my own reflection in her black eyes. I waited until it was almost too late, and I fired. All 6 rounds struck her, with the last catching her right between those dead, soulless eyes. She dropped to the ground. But I remembered, silver cannot kill, it only slows. I pulled out the crystalline rock that killed the very creature that started this nightmare and approached the master with caution. I could hear her rapid, short breaths as her body worked to push out the silver-tipped bullets. I rolled her over and raised the crystalline rock above my head, ready to plunge it into her heart. But I was blindsided. My sister tackled me to the ground. "You cannot kill us," she screamed, her eyes now full black orbs. "She is the killer. She is evil." "I am your sister," I screamed back. She showed her teeth and leaned in so close I could feel her cold breath on my neck. "You are food," she hissed. She opened wide and bit down. I could feel her sharp, jagged teeth as they pierced my skin, tearing at my flesh. I had no choice. I had to fight back. I only meant to hurt her when I plunged the crystalline rock into her side. She howled in pain and rolled off of me. I saw the strange salted rock do its work as the skin around her wound started to shrivel and dry. I went to pull it out, but she pushed me away and grabbed hold of it herself. She yanked at the deadly stake piercing into her side, trying to remove the crystalline rock. But it broke. The larger part fell to the ground with a dull end. The rest remained inside her, eating away at her innards. She looked me in the eyes one more time, and for a moment, just a moment, I could see the face of the little girl I once knew. She collapsed to the ground as her ribcage collapsed in on itself. She was gone. I looked back to the master, but the place where she fell was now just a spot of wet blood on the asphalt. I looked frantically for her, the orange flames of the fire illuminating everything. She was still alive, and I was defenseless. I picked up the dull, crystalline rock and ran towards the cruiser. I could feel the moisture leach out of my hands as I gripped the rock as tight as I could. The explosion shattered the front window of the cruiser, so I had to work fast. From the front seat, I retrieved the items I'd taken from the sheriff's body: handcuffs, keys, and his service pistol. When I stood up and turned around, she was already there, a silhouette among the backdrop of flames. I fired again. The bullet struck her chest, but she did not flinch. Instead, she flashed a ghoulish smile. There were nowhere to hide, and I knew that it was impossible to outrun her, so I chose the only safe place I could think of. I threw open the back door to the cruiser and crawled in, though I was careful not to pull it shut just yet. The master leapt onto the hood of the car and sneered at me through the metal gate separating the front and back seats. Slowly, she crossed over to the opposite side of the car, her gaze locked on me like the predator she was. I was backed against the door, ready to push it open behind me, but even then I knew I couldn't outrun her. She opened the rear door across from me. Her long, clawed nails gripped the metal grate over the window as she pushed the door wide open. I know she was sure that she had me trapped, so she toyed with her prey. She moved slow and deliberate as she crawled into the back seat with me, her pitch-black eyes swirling with reflections of the fire outside. She smiled and her jagged, toothy grin was revealed, dripping with foul-smelling slime. Again, I waited until she was close enough to kill, and then I taunted her. "This is what I used to kill your maker," I said, holding up the broken crystal and rock. Her emotionless eyes remained fixed on mine. Her expression was unchanging. With an inhumane quickness, she grabbed hold of my wrist, tight enough to break a bone, but I held the rock as long as I could. I watched her eyes and waited. The moment she broke away to glance at the dull, broken rock that killed her creator, I acted. With my free hand, I slammed the handcuff link onto her wrist. She squeezed tight with retribution, and I could hear the bones snap. I dropped the rock and kicked backwards. I tumbled out of the cruiser and into the parking lot, hitting the asphalt with a sickening thud. She then leapt at me, but fell short, unable to break free from the handcuff that I had secured to the metal dividing grate inside. I kicked the door shut and then ran around the vehicle as she yanked at the handcuffs. I slammed the other door shut. With a free hand, she tried to open the door, but found it locked from the outside. Slowly, I stepped away, watching the violent flurry of movement as she struggled to break free from the restraints. She kicked at the metal-grated windows, managing only to dent them. From a distance, I watched the fire burn in the darkness, hidden by the night sky, and I waited for her to die. I was waiting for sunrise to come and purge this world of her evil. From the back seat of the cruiser, she screamed and threw herself against the windows. I watched her fight for hours, locked in the back seat. Eventually, she even resorted to gnawing off her own hand. Thick black blood spurted from her wound, spraying the glass and obstructing my view inside. As the sun crept over the trees, she stopped fighting. I wasn't sure if she accepted her death or just expended the last of murderous will to live. I expected to hear her scream as the sun took her body, but she did not. I watched as the flames inside the vehicle licked at the blood-spattered windows, and I knew that she was dead. Just as Graham's body became a charred black husk, so did that of my sister and the old man. The master, though, she burned so hot, nothing but dust remained in the back seat of the cruiser. As I stood over the corpse of what I now knew was never my sister, I realized that I was no longer linked to this hellish place. I was free of the tether of the bloodline that kept me here, burdened by a sense of loyalty to a family that was never mine. I emptied the safe of the blood money that was meant to maintain this motel forever. There was no longer anything that held meaning for me here. So I watched as the flames leapt from room to room, and eventually the office and the cottage itself. The smoke from the septic tank burn pit still billowed thick black smoke, and I hoped that whoever came, it would draw their attention there. I hoped that finding those bodies would bring closure to the families who lost their loved ones to the dead roads. I hoped that those bodies would be the last. I hoped that I had actually ended it tonight. I hope that after hearing my story, you will understand. I hope that if you ever meet a family that seemingly never ages, you will know what they are and know that whatever they promise, you will never be a part of their family. I left in their old station wagon with nothing but a duffel bag of old bills, no longer bound to the motel by a legacy of blood. As I passed the fire engines on the way down the mountain, I thought to myself, the family may have been able to live forever, but until now, I had never been able to live at all. That's the end of the story. If you have hooked up till here, then hit like button and comment down your views. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then do support me by subscribing, so you may not miss any video in future.